Welcome to the Passion for Patients podcast. I'm Tonya Winders, the president and CEO of GAAPP, and your host for today's episode. I'm excited today to be joined by Hilary Hodge. I had the opportunity to meet Hilary at the European Respiratory Society meeting in 2025, and immediately we hit it off in talking about some shared passion and interest. And so Hilary's joining us from France, and I really appreciate you making the time to come and to sit down with us on the Passion for Patients podcast. Welcome, Hilary.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. So, why don't we just kind of get started with you telling us maybe a little bit about yourself? And I love to hear why you are a passionate patient advocate yourself.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the second question first, and then I can talk a little bit about my history. But I really developed a passion for advocating for patients with my same conditions after I developed adrenal insufficiency, which, as you know, is a form of pretty much mostly adrenal failure that is caused by um, heavy prednisone use. And in my case, it was to treat constant asthma exacerbations that I was having. And in spite of being prescribed prednisone for years and years and years, no one, I mean, and I had wonderful GPs. I want to be very clear. I had a fantastic care. And as you mentioned, I'm living in France, but at this time, I spent, lived most of my adult life in the United States. I was being seen by fantastic doctors in New York City and Chicago. So this is no criticism of them, rather an industry norm, unfortunately, that is not to check cortisol levels, even in spite of giving regular and heavy prednisone as a medication. So I found out I had developed adrenal insufficiency when I went into an adrenal crisis and wound up in the hospital. And unfortunately, that happens, it seems, to an awful lot of patients with severe asthma. I meet people with the identical story all the time. And so it's a pretty specific niche, but I became an advocate for that exact reason because I feel strongly that if patients are being put on prednisone, whether it's for asthma, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, you name it, any sort of inflammatory condition, they need to be having their cortisol checked regularly. And their doctors, GPs, and specialists need to better understand that this is a pretty common side effect of long-term OCS use. So, bit of a long answer, but that is why I became a patient advocate.
Well, thank you for sharing. And unfortunately, I wish that I could say that your story is an anomaly or a story that we don't hear very often. And yet, in working with patients over these last, 15, 20 years, it is a story that is very common. It is quite common, of course, in conditions like asthma, but also in COPD, we're seeing more and more steroid use, even though it may not always be appropriate steroid use. And so I think it is a matter of, again, years ago, maybe that was the way that we managed care and the way we managed exacerbations. And so it was, again, no slight to any doctor. That was the best thing we had, right? And so that's what we used. But as we now know, there are long-term consequences. So take us a little bit through the details of number one, what are some of your underlying conditions that you received prednisone for? And then number two, when it became adrenal insufficiency or like a crisis of how it impacted your body.
Sure. So I have asthma. I've had asthma my whole life. I was diagnosed when I was 8, and I'm sure you've seen this in many of your patients. It was pretty mild to moderate for many for really 3 decades, almost 3 decades. As long as I avoided my triggers, for me, I have allergic asthma, so it was my key allergens. I was fine. I used to run, half marathon distances for fun at night after work. I was in great shape. And then again, as I'm sure you've seen in your patients, I'm just one of the, unfortunately, 8 to 10% of people with severe asthma that it just kind of goes off a cliff for no clear reason, becomes untreatable no matter how many meds I'm on. And so I started in about my mid 30s struggling with pretty constant exacerbations that were requiring lots and lots and lots of prednisone. I was put on a biologic, but it was a little too late. I think access to
Mm,
medication is another huge piece of my platform because
yes.
biologics are just too expensive. They need to be introduced earlier so that patients can avoid developing what happened to me. Because
Mm,
I qualified for Xolair for years, but was not able to get on it because of the price. So by the time I did get on it, it was too late. So,
mm,
so going back to the timeline, so yeah, in mid 30s, asthma getting worse and worse and worse, lots of prednisone, and after one particularly rough bout, I tapered down as you're supposed to do, and just felt awful. And I'll describe it just in case it's helpful to any patients
yeah.
that are on prednisone, so they can know the symptoms to look out for. But I just felt suddenly so dizzy, so out of it, really dehydrated, but really knew something was quite wrong. I went to the hospital and had a unfortunate experience that also happens to a lot of patients where they don't realize that the doctors did not realize I was having an adrenal crisis because it is rare enough that they don't always
Yes.
recognize it. So I basically diagnosed myself online, sitting in the waiting room and Googling and realizing, oh gosh, this could be from tapering off months of prednisone. So I gave myself the treatment that I saw on the website of 100 milligrams of hydrocortisone, just chewing the pills
Yeah.
that I had. And so from there, I saw an endocrinologist and was officially diagnosed. And I've never recovered. Some people, their adrenals start to work again. Mine have always stayed. I mean, the index for my 8 a.m. blood draw, which should be around 60 at the lowest, going up to about 180, is usually around 5. So my
Wow.
adrenals just have not recovered at all. So I
Wow.
take the replacement dose every day, and have just had to learn. It's been about 7 years now, so it's a challenging road of learning how to increase your dose when you're sick to mimic what your body
Yeah.
would do naturally. When I was in childbirth, I had to have special
Yeah.
accommodations. So,
Yeah. And so, you touched on this, but how does it really impact like your day to day? Because I think that here's the thing, across most of the world, people say, come on, Tanya, what's the big deal? I mean, it's just a little steroid. Like it's not going to really hurt anyone. It's inexpensive. It addresses the symptoms. It gets people over the hump of whatever, symptoms they're feeling, exacerbation or what have you. And so what really is the harm? So tell us what is the harm? I mean, like how does it impact the day to day and what do you have to be more thoughtful or concerned about today than before you had the adrenal insufficiency?
well, a metaphor that I often use to describe it, and I know that you're a mom because we were chatting about mom things,
Okay.
so you can probably imagine this. I tell people it's kind of like having two toddlers that either take turns tantruming or maybe they're tantruming at the same time because sometimes my asthma is really acting up and I'm just miserable. Sometimes my adrenal insufficiency is acting up. Sometimes they're doing it at the same time. And that's what I feel like I
Yes.
have twin toddlers that are just
Yes.
losing it in the candy aisle or something like that.
Great
And
analogy.
and it's rough. I do think adrenal insufficiency is very, very poorly understood. It's rare, so it took me years of seeing endocrinologists to feel like I finally figured out the right rhythm and treatment for myself. But I can tell you it's an absolute daily struggle.
Yeah.
Um, I'm pretty I'm a pretty cheerful person. I'm pretty type A. I'm pretty good about turning the things that happen to me into, feel like I have a lemon body, make it
Yes.
into lemonade with advocacy, right? So I'm pretty straightforward when it comes to all of this, but I definitely have low days. I mean, I think the biggest challenge is your body naturally makes cortisol about 40, as much as 40 times a day. And sometimes it's lower.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to mimic that, taking pills a couple times a day, you just feel off all the time. Like you can just tell that it's not quite right.
Yeah.
And when I tell people with diabetes about adrenal insufficiency, because they are similar, but they're just astonished because they're like, but how do you measure? Because they can measure their blood glucose, they have
Exactly.
pumps.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I
not,
mean, I have a nephew. a great nephew who has type 1 diabetes. He wears a monitor. He knows at all times. We have him, everyone has the app on their phone. We know at all times kind of what his level is and how things are what need to be adjusted accordingly. And even at 8 years old, Weston can completely manage his type 1 diabetes. And I think about in adrenal insufficiency, it's quite different because really there is no easy way to continue to monitor that. And the even the endocrinologist and the field of endocrinology is not fully in agreement on the best way to manage this. And then you throw in that much of this in our space is managed by a pulmonologist or an allergist who knows very, very little about endocrinology and adrenal
Hmm.
insufficiency.
Hmm.
And so I think it does become a very complex comorbidity that unfortunately is really you're left to be your own best advocate and expert.
And it's, I mean, this is what I would say to the people telling you that it's just a little pill, it'll bring down your inflammation, is it makes your potassium and sodium drop, which are critical to blood pressure. And but supplementing potassium is very complicated. Can give you palpitations and chest pain and be very scary, and it's sometimes dangerous. Sodium is not just about salt, right? When your sodium's low, you feel awful. My blood pressure can drop sometimes to like 80 over 50 or zoom up to 130 over 80. I mean, it just really wreaks havoc on blood pressure. It causes your testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and DHEA to drop quite a bit. My DHEA is about 50 when it should be, I think, 600.
Really.
So,
Yeah.
and those are critical. People tend to think of those as reproductive hormones, but they're critical for digestion, for cognitive functioning. So, and doctors very rarely talk to you about supplementing, even endocrinologists supplementing hormones. So we're looking at a disease that causes, all kinds of fluctuations in critical chemicals and hormones in your body that doctors don't even necessarily realize or test for. They might not realize they're low or test for that. And not to mention, again, going back to parenting, being the parent of a small child who's in daycare getting sick every 2 seconds.
Yes.
I was trying to figure out my updosing because you have to increase, you don't know how much without that monitor, without the equivalent of the monitor, like you're talking about, you just kind of wait for your symptoms to kick in. So that is my answer to the people that that
Yeah,
tell
it's
you it's
much
just a
more
little pill.
complicated than and really than people estimate and understand. And I think that even getting to the right specialist that respects that you are the expert of your own body and oftentimes before there's ever any test to confirm it and validate it, when something's not quite right and when
Hmm.
things are off. Um, so one of the big debates or evolutions of this has been around the word steroid toxicity. And I'll tell you, back in 2017, the first time I used that term, a group of specialists literally threw stones at me. I mean, they were so upset with me and said, "You cannot say that. Like, you absolutely can't scare people away from using prednisone." And I understood, but I was hearing firsthand from people like you with lived experience who were telling me, "Look, this is my best friend because it does address the symptoms and helps me to live my life, but it's my worst enemy because of the short-term and long-term side effects." Even, not going to the full extreme of adrenal insufficiency. And now that I've been in this for 8 years, 9 years down the road, and the data is so much stronger than it was then, um, I have some of those same experts beginning to use the term steroid toxicity. Um, and so I settled on the steroid stewardship message about 8, 9 years ago. But I can tell you that the longer I'm in it, the more strongly I feel that there is a need for us to truly understand the risk of steroids, of oral steroids, and of cumulative steroids on a body. And secondly, to use strong language when strong language is warranted, like steroid toxicity. So what's your feeling about that term?
I think you summarized the whole issue very well. I mean, I just agree with everything you were just saying, and I also completely understand, and it sounds like we both do, that of course steroids can be enormously helpful. Of course, I mean, if you're, especially for people that are in a very critical kind of inflammatory situation,
Yeah,
Crohn's, I mean, where kidney disease, an organ transplant, I mean, there are
yeah,
situations where steroids are absolutely life-saving.
right.
But that doesn't mean that doctors can't think about, and like I said, just small steps, adding a check to, if a patient's been on prednisone 3 times a year, to just check their cortisol level, just to be on the safe side. Very small things like that to
Exactly.
educate them that just keep an eye out for those same symptoms I mentioned earlier, because no one ever told me that in years and years and years of giving me the drug. So I think toxicity, I like it because what I think it also gets at is, I attended a great severe asthma conference where Ian Pavord was speaking. I mean, he's this
Yes.
great severe asthma specialist, and he was talking about how at Oxford, he's humiliated. He was kind of joking, but not really, that when he's with his fellow cardiologists and nephrologists and rheumatologists, he's the only one whose field waits for organs to fail before they
Yes.
give maximum treatment, and that it's too
I've
late,
heard him
right?
say that before.
And I
Yes.
would and I would add adrenals to that, right? I mean, it's not just the lung that's failing. If a patient is been on prednisone, even more. I love that on your website. I was reading the stat that even 4 courses can have a huge impact on the body, right? And I mean, it's so important to just get tangible information points like that out to clinicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, researchers. I mean, patients of every stripe, right? Because it does change the tide of thinking about, you know,
Yeah.
again, not waiting to an organ for an organ to fail till you do
Until
something
it's too
about it.
late, right? Until it's too late. And so I think that one of the things I shared with you is I have the opportunity to be a GINA advocate for the Global Guidelines Committee in asthma. And I've been advocating and pushing for OCS as a last resort, which thankfully GINA reflects as of 2024. But I've actually requested that it be a step six. Like if you think about the final maintenance OCS, not as needed, fewer than 1 or 2 bursts in a year, I can sort of see, not over extended period without really stepping through all the other treatment options. But maintenance OCS to me should be an absolute end of the road, last resort, step sits in Gina. Tell me if you agree or disagree with that position.
I mean, as I said, I really wish I'd been started on biologics sooner. I know not all biologics work for all patients. It's really only 30-40% remission. So the big bulk of us are not achieving that remission yet. But
Yeah.
I think biologics should be started after a couple bad exacerbations, and that we should figure out a way policy-wise to make that possible in terms of affordability and access to biosimilars. And that to me is crystal clear. And I love your shifting OCS down the steps,
Yeah.
because everything I just described about my life and how it's hard, I have to deal with for the rest of my life. This is not a temporary side effect that I had.
Yes.
And if I am ever in a situation where I can't access my medication for any reason, I will die. Like if you cannot supplement
Yes.
for a day or two, it is a fatal illness. So it is not, just because it's a rare outcome of steroid use does not mean it should be disregarded. I can tell you that in my severe asthma support groups, the bulk of people have adrenal insufficiency. So it is not that rare when it comes to our community.
Yeah, I mean, there in the rare disease space, they often say rare isn't rare, and I think that that's the same thing in this case of adrenal insufficiency. And again, getting to perhaps that final point, but the harm that's done along the way, and again, as providers, the very first thing is first do no harm. And so if we know better, we do better. And I feel like that's where we are with the use of systemic steroids. We know better, we can do better, and it's really the time that we implore our providers to do what can be done rather than doing harm with overuse of steroids. So, thank you, Hilary. This has been such a great, conversation, and your personal experience, along with your professional understanding and just your empowered way of speaking up for yourself and for others, truly is inspirational. So, thank you for spending the time with us here today on Passion for Patients.
Oh, thank you. I thank you for all your great questions. It's I appreciate the opportunity to talk about all of this. So thank you.
And thanks to you guys, our listeners, for tuning in today. I hope you found this episode to be interesting and engaging. I hope that as we come to the close of 2025, that you continue to be inspired to stretch for oral corticosteroid stewardship in your own country, in your own policy work, and that again, together, we can truly make a change for the millions of people that are living with chronic respiratory diseases and impacted by these conditions. Until next time, stay passionate.